When Baha'u'llah passed away in 1892, no country in the world gave women voting rights equal to those of men. In no country of the world were women given the vote in 1892 when Baha'u'llah passed away. And in subsequent years, beginning with New Zealand in 1893 and Australia in 1902 and then other countries after that, gradually nearly all the countries of the world which allow any form of voting have given some degree of voting rights to women. It's interesting that in the United States, as early as 1848, a women's rights convention produced a declaration calling for the sacred right to the elective franchise to be granted to women, although it was almost 80 years before that was brought into effect. In employment, there have obviously been great strides forward in the opportunities for women in employment, in professions that are open to them, although there is, of course, still resistance in the traditional professions such as medicine and law, the physical sciences. Lest we become too self-satisfied with the progress that has been made to the emancipation of women over the last 100 years, we should also consider what are some of the present-day deficiencies. For example, the United Nations in 1980 determined that women, who of course are 1/2 the world's population, do 2/3 of the work in the world. They get 1/10 of the income, own 1/100th of the world's property, and they are 2/3 of the world's illiterates. So obviously there are still great deficiencies. Female infanticide continues today in India and China. The shameful practice of female genital mutilation continues in many areas of the world. Wife burning in India is not uncommon when the wife produces insufficient dowry. And so on. The rise of fundamentalism I've referred to. There are many other such issues. The Baha'i International Community in New York in 1984 surveyed 70 national spiritual assemblies of the world, asking their views about the status of women in their countries. And the response from these 70 national spiritual assemblies showed that this traditional inequality existed in almost all nations. Male dominance in decision-making, restriction on freedom of women to travel, the machismo superiority attitude, the lack of appreciation of women's opinion in discussions. There are still major barriers to promotion in the workplace. Women tend to occupy the lower paid and less influential positions in most organizations. With the rise of vice in declining societies around the world, the position of women has been further jeopardized. The rise of pornography, the alliance of pornography and violence, the use of sexist advertising, the victimization of women by criminals and psychopaths, the fear of rape, the forcing of women into prostitution because of lack of employment opportunities, women being identified as a scapegoat for unemployment, for marriage breakdown and child delinquency. All of these are examples of the deficiencies which still exist in the present day in the treatment of women. Before turning to the Baha'i teachings, let us briefly look at the role of women historically in the family. Almost all human societies thus far have defined the man to be the head of the household, and this term has been interpreted in this way, that the wife is to be obedient to the husband, the male dominates in decision-making, and the wife is mainly confined to the home. For example, in Christianity we find in Ephesians, "Wives, be subject to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Saviour. As the church is subject to Christ, so let wives also be subject in everything to their husbands. And we find similar practices in the other societies of the world. The female reaction to this male domination in the home has been of two kinds. One kind is submissive acceptance, even playing up to it, the so-called helpless female syndrome that one reads about from time to time, and the other form has been suppressed rebellion through antagonism, through attempting to destroy the image of the husband with the children, through backbiting and the like. All of these reactions to male domination within the home. One of the tragic features of human society has been the enforcement of male domination within the home by the use of physical force and its extreme form in wife beating. And most human societies seem to have been tainted with the stigma of this practice in distant times and in contemporary times. British common law in the 19th century authorized a husband, quote, to chastise his wife with any reasonable instrument. Later, the courts were called upon to define what they meant by a reasonable instrument, and they defined it to be a rod no thicker than a man's thumb. In other words, a man could chastise his wife provided he used a rod, a piece of wood no thicker than his thumb. In 1871, courts in the United States decided it was time to rescind an ancient privilege. And that ancient privilege was that of the right of the man to beat his wife with a stick, to pull her hair, choke her, spit in her face, or kick her about the floor, or to inflict upon her like indignities. These are passages quoted from the ruling of a United States court in 1871. They said the time has come for us to start rescinding this kind of practice. And as I'm sure many of you are well aware, wife beating is not unknown in the present day. I was reading recently a report of a court case in New York State where a woman was convicted of killing her husband. And in the trial it came out that he had kicked her downstairs, he'd locked her in the trunk of the car, he'd held her under a scalding shower and burnt her with cigarettes. The end of that, over a period of years, she killed him, and she's now serving a prison term of 15 years to life. So wife beating is a problem which exists in the present day as well as the distant past. A recent sociological study of wife beating came to this conclusion, quote, full sexual equality is essential for the prevention of wife beating. Now, with that survey complete, let us turn to an examination of the Baha'i teachings on this very important and quite complex subject. The Guardian says the position of women in the Baha'i teachings is not only legal but also spiritual and educational. And we can consider these teachings under several categories. Firstly, the intrinsic principle of equality. And I will quote from a number of passages, most of which are found in the compilation on women recently issued by the Universal House of Justice and prepared by the Research Department at the Baha'i World Center. Firstly, on the principle of equality. There are statements, for example, of Baha'u'llah, where he says, in this day the hand of divine grace has removed all distinctions. The servants of God and his handmaidens are regarded on the same plane. And Abdul Baha refers to men and women and says, from the spiritual viewpoint, there is no difference between them. So our statements in our religious writings are very clear and explicit. From the spiritual viewpoint, there is no difference between men and women. In another place, Abdu'l-Baha refers to the world of humanity as having two parts, male and female, and says each is the complement of the other. From the spiritual viewpoint, no difference. In practical consequence, each is the complement of the other. There are statements where the writings call upon men and women to avoid exaltation of one over the other, and which state that the laws should be equally applicable to men and to women. Secondly, the Baha'i teachings on marriage and on the family. Here we find an important and significant difference between the Baha'i teachings and the practice in human societies around the world for centuries and probably for millennia. Because in our religion, the relationship in marriage and within the family is to be based upon equality, with consultation, without domination of one over the other. Let me read some passages. The House of Justice said, "The atmosphere within a Baha'i family, as within the community as a whole, should express the keynote of the cause of God, which the beloved guardian has stated is not dictatorial authority, but humble fellowship, not arbitrary power, but the spirit of frank and loving consultation." In another place, the House of Justice referred to decision-making between husband and wife. They said, "Family consultation employing full and frank discussion, animated by awareness of the need for moderation and balance, can be the panacea for domestic conflict. Wives should not attempt to dominate their husbands, nor husbands their wives." Note the contrast between this and the male domination in decision-making, which has been a feature of marriage down through the ages. On this point of consultation, we as Baha'is are familiar with Baha'i consultation in a larger setting where the majority view applies. What happens in a marriage where there is husband and wife and consultation is occurring? How are decisions to be made? The House of Justice said, "There are times when a wife should defer to her husband, and times when a husband should defer to his wife. But neither should ever unjustly dominate the other." And in another place, the House of Justice further clarified this point by saying exactly under what circumstances such deference should take place is a matter for each couple to decide. The House of Justice has found it necessary on at least one occasion to write about family violence and wife beating. And let me read to you the statement of the House of Justice on this subject. "Violence in the family is antithetical to the spirit of the faith and a practice to be condemned. If the broad structure of society is to remain intact, resolute efforts, including medical ones as necessary, should be made to curb acts of aggression within families, particularly their extreme forms of wife beating and child abuse by parents." Baha'u'llah himself, in one passage, has referred to the importance of avoiding tyranny of women by men. And again, let me read that passage. Baha'u'llah states, "The friends of God must be adorned with the ornament of justice, equity, kindness, and love, as they do not allow themselves to be the subject of cruelty and transgression. In like manner, they should not allow such tyranny to visit the handmaidens of God." Woman has the primary responsibility of being the first educator of the child, just as man has the primary responsibility of being the breadwinner of the family. If that was all there were to the Baha'i teachings, our position would be quite traditional. Woman in the home, man outside as breadwinner. But that is not all. There is provision in the Baha'i writings for role flexibility, and it states very clearly that the place of woman is not confined to the home. Let me read a passage from the House of Justice. The House of Justice states, the concept of a Baha'i family is based on the principle that the man has primary responsibility for the financial support of the family, and the woman is the chief and primary educator of the children. This by no means implies that these functions are inflexibly fixed and cannot be changed and adjusted to suit particular family situations. Nor does it mean that the place of woman is confined to the home. Rather, while primary responsibility is assigned, it is anticipated that fathers would play a significant role in the education of the children, and women could also be breadwinners. So our teachings allow for a significant degree of role flexibility, far more than exists in traditional societies. The role of women in society in the Baha'i teachings arises from the fact that our teachings call for an identical curriculum for girls as for boys. Traditionally, in most Western societies, the boys study physical sciences and the girls do domestic science or domestic arts. An identical curriculum would mean that the girls also would study the physical sciences and the boys also would study domestic arts. And there would be a greater capability and a greater preparation for the world of the future. The writings identify special areas where women can play a significant role. For example, Abdu'l-Baha speaks of women entering confidently and capably the great arena of laws and politics, and says that is important for war to cease. In another place, Abdu'l-Baha says, woman must especially devote her energies and abilities towards the industrial and agricultural sciences, seeking to assist mankind in that which is most needful. So these and other passages disclose our larger view of the role of women outside the home, in industry, agriculture, law, politics, and other areas. And the House of Justice has stated in the Tablet of the World, Baha'u'llah himself has envisaged that women as well as men would be breadwinners. And there are other passages which identify in the Baha'i teachings the legitimacy of the role of women as income producers, and calls upon women to determine how best they can fulfill that together with the responsibilities of motherhood. The House of Justice states, it is for every woman, if and when she becomes a mother, to determine how best she can discharge, on the one hand, her chief responsibility as a mother, on the other, to the extent possible, to participate in other aspects of the activities of the society of which she forms a part. So much for some of the Baha'i teachings on the equality of men and women. There are two other teachings, though, I would like to mention. Our teachings on sexual morality provide a wonderful protection to women as well as to men to freely mix in the day-to-day activities of society, outside the home, in social mixing, in business, in professions, in schools and the like, without the problems, for example, of sexual harassment, which has become quite a problem to a number of women in their involvement in the larger society. And so our teachings on sexual morality liberate both men and women for this larger interaction in the broader dimensions of society. And we, I think, should not fail to mention the importance of the covenant, because the covenant is a protection to women in many ways. Through the infallibility of the